Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National's podcast. I'm Steph Braun, one of the political reporters at the National, and today we've got a special guest with us in Mark Diffley, polling expert, our second polling expert recently, having had Sir John Curtis in recently as well. How are you doing today, Mark?
I'm very good.
Good.
Yeah, just in from Edinburgh, so yeah, all good.
You made it through the
Another
storm.
busy
The
day.
storm then that
The
isn't
storm
really hitting
hasn't
here yet.
the storm hasn't yet arrived. But what my journey back will be like, we'll see. We'll see. But yeah, I think it's the calm before the storm.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's it is pretty bad. I think in the northwest of Scotland. So our thoughts go out to you, and
Yeah,
we're hoping it doesn't hit too hard down here. Yeah, Mark, you set up Diffley Partnership in 2017, which we were just discussing before, about 8 years ago. It's
yes,
sort of flown. You've provided polling analysis and commentary on numerous political events over the years, from elections to the UK and Scottish parliaments to referendums on Scottish independence and EU membership and all things like that.
I am
So
very old. Yeah.
you've been through it all. So
Yeah.
I think before we get into discussions about polls, what got you into this line of work, really?
Gosh, well, I've been in Scotland now for 25 years. Still to pick up an accent. My children have got broad accents, but I'm afraid it's a bit too late for me, a bit too long in the tooth. So originally, I mean, I studied in London in the 90s and did a sort of very traditional politics and economics degree. But one of the modules, I think it was in the second year, was a sort of statistics module. I didn't really consider myself to be that kind of statistically literate, but I did, I sort of really enjoyed it and got into that, and then obviously into research and polling. From there. I mean, I've always been very interested in politics. Came from a sort of family that was quite politically sort of engaged down south, and but never really had ambitions to stand particularly. Thought it would be interesting, but kind of never really sort of found myself strongly believing in one political party enough, or one party or another enough to take that plunge. I mean, I completely admire people that do, or most of them at least. It's not an easy job. So if you're not in the thick of it in terms of being a representative, then I guess inputting from the side in terms of insights and data and polling is kind of the next best thing, really.
Yeah, of course. If you found that you weren't sort of aligned to any one
Yeah.
political party, I
Yeah.
guess that does lend itself to being neutral in this way,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
well, yeah, exactly. So, over the years, I've probably worked by which I mean, on projects with all the main political parties, actually.
Interesting.
One of the sort of benefits, I guess, in some ways at least, of Scotland is that the bubble is actually sort of quite small, so you get to know people really quickly.
Yeah.
Having sort of come up from London, that felt, I mean, obviously I'm more than used to it now, but that felt kind of quite weird, I guess, to begin with. I mean, both because of the size, but of course, actually, I think the sort of the culture of the parliament being more accessible and open,
Yeah.
and people being, sort of, dare I say it, more kind of friendly, but certainly more kind of open to talking, open to kind of getting to know you and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, I spent the first couple of years from sort of 2000 up to the sort of '03 election, just going to any event I could possibly get, meeting as many people as I possibly could. And that was actually quite an easy thing. To do here. It would have been much more difficult to do down there. So yeah, and being kind of independent from the kind of political fray it does have its benefits as well.
Yeah, it seems like Westminster has a few more barriers to cross than the
Yeah,
Scottish
I
part.
think
The Scottish part
yeah,
does seem quite open, and yeah. So I think we'll get on to discussing about polls at the
sure.
moment, which I feel like at the moment politics is very fragmented, and so there's all sorts of angles to discuss polls from. I think at the moment, which is really interesting. I think the first thing to discuss is the rapid downfall of Labour since they were elected last July. Um, I think people have been quite fascinated and quite struck by the pace of their decline, given that they won such a huge majority in government. But we know that came with, not actually being particularly popular
Yeah.
with voters. So what have you made of the pace of their decline, first of all?
Well, I mean, I think from a polling point of view, it's been incredible, both the speed at which it's happened, as you alluded to, and the depth to which it's happened. So to the extent to which it's happened. So whether you look at it from a kind of UK polling point of view or a Scotland point of view, and you look at Scottish Labour, they've lost about half their vote in just over a year.
Staggering, yeah.
From about 35% to the sort of high teens, maybe up to sort of 20% in some polls in Scotland.
Mm.
But that's the speed and the depth at which that has happened, and the kind of fragmentation is I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but they're losing votes in a number of different directions as well. So I think everyone's kind of obsessed with reform, sort of reform UK at the moment. I mean, we are here, and sort of UK wide we are, and so much commentary around how much Labour is losing to how much of the Labour vote is going to Reform UK, but actually equally on its kind of left flank, it's losing a lot of votes as well, particularly at UK level, to the sort of resurgent Green Party, also to the Lib Dems and so on. So,
Mm.
what that means is it makes a kind of solution to this. For a Labour strategist, it makes it harder because there's no, you've got to try and bring voters back from over here and voters back from over there.
Yeah.
So the coalition is sort of fragmented pretty quickly, and there's no other way to put it, but it's a real headache. I mean, I'm sure we'll come on and talk about Labour in Scotland in a bit, but
Yeah, of course, yeah.
but I mean, at the UK level, the party is in, if not a crisis, it's certainly in the doldrums, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever seen anything like this decline before in your time in studying polls?
No, not really, and I don't
Okay.
think in polling terms, even stretching back before my time, that it's happened quite as quickly. If you look at some of the numbers around the levels of satisfaction in the UK government or in the UK Prime Minister, they are sort of almost breaking records in ways that they kind of don't, unwanted records. But usually those records have been set by governments that have been in for a period of time and become unpopular over
Yeah.
a course of
Bit like the
over a
Tories, I
period of time.
suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. But for it to happen so quickly is kind of off the scale, really.
Yeah. I wonder what you think about how long Keir Starmer is likely to last as Prime Minister, because we had 11 Welsh Labour members of the Senedd last week writing to him saying he was rolling back on devolution. It certainly looks like he's going to lose Wales to potentially Plaid Cymru or perhaps Reform. It's a bit of a toss-up between the two, I think, at the moment. There was a story out yesterday as well that Labour Together, the think tank, which ran Keir Starmer's leadership campaign, is now canvassing for his replacement. Do you think the writing is on the wall for him?
I mean, I think it's still probably a bit early to say. I think there's kind of a number of ways of looking at this, and one is, well, who's the obvious replacement at this point?
Yep.
I'm not sure there is one. I don't think that there's a kind of standout candidates. I mean, there have been some who have sort of tried to put their head above the parapet a wee bit, like Andy Burnham earlier on in the year, for example. But it's hard to see who the absolute obvious candidate is that could go, that the whole party could kind of coalesce around, number one. So he may be just kind of safe-ish for now, just because of that fact. Then if it is someone like Andy Burnham, he's not in Parliament at the moment either, so there would have to be quite a long drawn-out process of getting him into Parliament, which is not going to happen overnight. Then before you then go into a kind of leadership bid, and then you kind of think, well, if you did want to take over, if you were an aspiring leader, would now really be the right time to do it 4 or 5 months out from what is likely to be, what looks like from a polling point of view, and as you've just alluded to there, looks like being, probably, let's be generous, a fairly bad night, at least for Labour, both here in Wales and, of course, in the English local authorities that they are defending. So would you want to own that, or would you want to wait until that kind of plays out?
Yeah, pick it up afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a number of factors that I think we're maybe kind of underpricing him hanging on, at least for the next sort of 6 months or so. But if you take a longer term look, beyond the devolved and English elections next year, then you have to say it looks fairly unlikely. But well, as we'll talk about with polling, as we sort of alluded to at the beginning, things change at such a pace. I mean,
Yeah,
that does sound like a bit of a cliche, but
they do.
if they
Yeah.
can improve, perceptions of public services, if we can get some growth into the economy, and if they can avoid making some of the sort of really bad mistakes that they've made in the first 18 months, then there may be a narrative to sort of change a bit. But it looks pretty tough, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that lots of people are speculating that Wales is the big one because obviously
Yeah.
the Labour have not been the biggest party in Scotland for quite some time now. But Labour have a huge history in Wales, and I think all the polls point to that Wales is going to look extremely different come next May. So do you think that uh, more so than the local elections and the Scottish elections, do you think Wales is the big one in terms of Labour? Is if that does not go well for them, is that really going to be the indefensible thing that they're going to face?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think all three in their own way, if they go
Mm.
badly, and they probably won't go equally as badly um, as each other. So it might depend on quite how bad it is in any one of those particular three
Yeah,
events that are going on. Wales does look sort of particularly bad at the moment. You're right, and of course the Caerphilly by-election that we had
yeah.
to the Welsh to the Senedd recently. Labour got about 11% of the vote, I think. So
Mm.
there's a lot of evidence from that many Labour voters were voting tactically for Plaid in order to kind of keep Reform out.
Mm.
But the national polling looks like it is a battle between Plaid and Reform to be the biggest party.
Yep.
And Labour are a long way behind in a way that in Scotland it's a bit different, but
Mm.
well, at least to the extent to which they're trailing.
Mm.
But yeah, Wales looks really, really, really tough.
Yeah. We'll talk about Scottish Labour a bit then, because as you've slightly alluded to, Labour's unpopular policies and their kind of downfall in the polls has had a clear knock-on effect for Scottish Labour.
Yeah.
Do you think Scottish Labour have any chance of recovering from that?
Well, there are still 5 months to go.
Yeah.
Sort of cliche bell going off. I mean, I am sort of old enough to remember, not that it's that long ago, but sort of the 2011 Holyrood election, where at this point in the cycle, actually Labour was ahead in the polls,
Okay.
or at least sort of tying with the SNP in the polls. And the SNP ended up winning, well, what is still the only overall majority
Yeah.
to have existed or to have happened in the Scottish Parliament. So there are precedents for things to change very dramatically over
Mm.
a short period of time. If I'm honest, the context is quite different. I think Labour were out of power at that point at the UK level.
Yep.
Um, um, and the SNP were in a minority government. We didn't do as much polling then as we do now.
Right.
So I think there
Interesting.
at points there were kind of sort of quite long periods where clearly things were changing on the ground, but we weren't measuring them quite as often
Mm.
as we do now. So, but I do think that's a kind of quite a salutary lesson, I think, to keep that election in mind. I mean, I still think it looks relatively unlikely. I mean, we talk about polling and public opinion being much more fluid these days. People much more see it as a kind of a marketplace rather than, when I was growing up, you were a Labour voter or you were a Tory voter, and you tended to stay with, to sort of stick with those almost kind of family traditions or community traditions in a way that we just don't tend to
Mm.
these days. So we don't have that same kind of party identification
Yeah.
that we used to have. But even so, the polling in Scotland has been actually relatively consistent in the last sort of 6 months or so.
Mm.
So since that kind of quite disruptive period where, Nicola Sturgeon resigned, the Humza Yousaf period, he resigned, Labour, sort of tracking up and up and up, having a great general election result.
Mm.
But that kind of period of the last year, actually, when Labour support kind of fell through the floor, they lost about half of their
Mm.
2024 voters actually relatively quickly after the election, back to our previous sort of
Yeah.
conversation about how quickly things happened. And, Labour has been in Scotland about sort of 18, 19, 20% now for about the last year.
Yeah.
The SNP has sort of tracked along at sort of mid-30s over that same period of time.
Mm.
Um, the reform sort of surge that we've seen since the general election, in some polls that continues to go up a wee bit, but that mainly happened as well sort of quite soon after the general election, and they're now around sort of, late teens, 20% in some polls as well.
Mm.
So it looks kind of, at this point, it looks kind of fairly baked in. And then you have to think, well,
Mm.
what are the things that might kind of change the weather? Of course, there is the Scottish budget coming up
Yeah.
in January, which is going to be I think, sort of big set piece event between
Mm.
now and the election. There'll be manifesto launches, of course. There'll be the campaign. There'll be the campaign itself.
Yeah.
Um, but you're sort of looking at the calendar, and you're looking at what might happen over the next sort of 4 or 5 months, and it's you can't see any obvious sort of ins really that will
No,
change the weather. It
completely
may
agree.
happen. There may be mistakes, there may be scandals, there may be whatever. But at this point, opinion looks relatively you know the pattern in the last kind of few months, last 6 months, 9 months is relatively consistent.
And that's really interesting. And if you were if you were a betting man, where do you think Scottish Labour would come then? Because I think we've seen them third, fourth. Is it difficult to say which one of those it would be, or
Well, there's still a good chance, I think, that they'll be second.
right?
Um, so depending on what poll you look at, but if you track if you look at a kind of an average kind of polar polls sort of thing, they're pretty much neck and neck with
Mm,
Reform
yeah.
in second place. The big hope for Labour for Labour in Scotland when you speak to them, so what they're sort of betting the house on, so to speak, is that at some point, or over a period of time, the electorate will start to focus on the record of the SNP rather than
Mm,
the record of the Labour government. So I've always kind of thought of this election coming up as it's a sort of the battle of two different incumbencies, really. There's the incumbency of what will by next year be a 19 years of the SNP.
yeah.
So I sort of chuckle when I say that, because every time I say it, I think 19 years, gosh.
Yeah, that's mad.
Um, versus the sort of what will then be a 2-year incumbency of the Labour government
Right.
in
Yeah.
Westminster. Now, I mean, they're years and years and years difference there,
Yeah.
but it does feel. I mean, it feels to me that at the moment the electorate is particularly unhappy with the Labour government, and particularly unhappy with some of the decisions that government has taken in the
Mm,
last 18 months, and they are therefore punishing Labour in Scotland for that as well.
yeah.
But we can't. We can't pretend that the SNP is a particularly popular government, because at the same time, in 2021, the SNP got 48% of the 48% of the
Mm,
vote, and it's now gone
nowhere
down
near
to
that.
sort of, well, let's say on average about 35%.
Yeah.
Any other metrics that look at sort of government popularity, first ministerial popularity, and so on, is well down on where it was at the last election.
Mm,
But the fracturing of the non-SNP vote is
yeah.
such that you can lose 10, 12 points, um, and it may not really touch the sides too much in terms of what the parliament will look like in sort of 5 months' time.
Yeah, it's fascinating how people can win elections by quite a long way now and actually not be all that
Y-
popular.
Yeah, I mean, and of
It's a bit
course
crazy.
we saw it in the general election
Yeah.
last year. I mean, it was a big majority, but it was very shallow.
Yes.
Um, which is why you've got so many twitchy Labour backbench MPs at the moment, because many of them are looking at very small majorities and thinking, well, unless things change, that will get absolutely wiped out.
Yeah.
And of course, the SNP, while we have a different voting system, it's still predominantly a first past the post system. So most
Yes.
MSPs are elected on a first past the post constituency basis,
Mm,
and that is where the SNP pick up the vast majority. I think of the 64 SNP MSPs that were elected last time. 62 of them were from the constituency ballot, and only two from the regional list.
mm,
So I think it does go to show that that's that kind of 35% can, if your opponents are kind of fractured um, then it can be enough to win the vast majority of those seats back again.
Yeah, so of course, John Swinney's talked about in his kind of independent strategy. He's talked about if we get a majority in Holyrood, then that gives us kind of a mandate to negotiate a new
Yeah.
referendum. I'm guessing you don't really see any chances of an SNP
Well,
majority.
I mean, interestingly, I think when you talk to people inside the SNP, they're sort of almost increasingly confident that that will happen. But um, well, I don't think many of them think it's likely to happen, but they think it's more likely to happen now than when you had a conversation with them, say 6 months ago.
Right. Yeah.
And that is largely, of course, because of what's happening to Labour
Yeah.
as well. Um, the modelling. So when we look at kind of an individual poll, and then you sort of model it onto, if that happened exactly like that in the election, what would then the chamber look like in terms of the distribution of seats? I mean, it still looks like the SNP would have, somewhere in the mid to high 50s, but be kind of maybe 8 or 10 seats short of an overall majority, and sort of 65 is the magic number to get to that majority, which feels kind of quite close. But of course, the voting system kicks in, the PR bit of the voting system kicks
Yeah.
in
Kind of
to
stops it,
make
doesn't it? Yeah.
to make that really to make that hard,
Very hard.
right? And the people that designed the voting system for Holyrood, had that in mind.
Yeah.
We wanted it to be different to Westminster. We wanted it to be a more kind of consensual and balanced parliament that reflected voter opinion in more kind of proportionate ways. Now, of course, in 2011, the scale of that, I mean, almost 50% of the vote that the SNP got, so that was enough to kind of break the system. 35%, which is where we're at now, that looks unlikely.
Yeah.
I have to say so. But there are people within the party that still think that's possible. I think it's a bit of a long shot still, but
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I want to talk about reform a little bit, because there was at one stage big fears that they might be the next party to form the next UK government. There's an element of fear about them getting seats in Scotland. I think they will, given the PR system.
Yep.
But it does seem as though they may have peaked in the polls. We've started to see them sort of plateau a bit. Is that what you've picked up on as well?
Yeah, certainly UK. I mean, certainly UK wide. So the polling is more abundant at a UK wide level. So even today, there's a YouGov poll out that has them at, I think it's 27 or 28%.
Right.
Now, which is and more importantly, the track of the kind of poll of polls at a UK level, yes, they are starting to sort of, well, plateau or sort of tick down slightly. Now, let's be clear, if that YouGov poll, if there's an election tomorrow and it came out in the way that YouGov poll suggested, they would still by far be the biggest party,
Yeah.
albeit quite a long way short, or a way short of an overall majority
Right.
in the House of Commons. But so there's a story here of what's going on under the surface. There's been a bit of a Tory recovery at UK level. Not really seeing it in Scotland yet. Or we may or may not, but a little bit. There is also, of course, reform under a bit more scrutiny, I think. I think it's fair to say that they've probably at UK level made a few mistakes along the way recently, and there have been any number of stories about court cases or allegations from the leaders past and all this kind of stuff, which even at the margins may make some voters kind of think again. So this sort of inexorable march up the hill to what looked like, we may be having to sort of adjust our expectations slightly about that, but it is still fair to say that they're the biggest party at UK level.
Yeah. Why do you think they might have plateaued and tipped down slightly?
Well, as I say, it might be because of some of the sort of negativity that's around
Yeah.
the party at the moment. I think they have made some mistakes around well, they've got themselves into quite a lot of political trouble.
Yeah.
As I was saying, whether it's the kind of allegations around the leader's past and around these allegations of when he was at
Course.
school,
Yeah.
the stuff around the guy in Wales the ex-Welsh
Nathan Gill,
UKIP
yeah.
leader who has recently been sentenced as a result of the kind of Russian stuff that he was involved in. So all of this stuff kind of has created a bit more of a negativity around the party, I think, than has been apparent in the past. And it may be, and of course, there's a bit more scrutiny around the party now. So when they make
Yeah.
announcements, there is a bit more scrutiny around what they're actually saying and the extent to which it's being thought through and so on and so forth. So there may be a kind of combination of things that are going on under the surface, which is not kind of wiping out their support, but which is, I think, there is some evidence, I think, from UK-wide polling to suggest that a peak has sort of been reached, at least for now,
Mm.
and perhaps even there's a slight downturn,
Yeah.
albeit that they're still the biggest party at UK level.
So how many seats is it kind of looking like they might get in Scotland at the moment?
Well, so in Scotland, the party is, they got 7% at the general election last year from a standing start and without much of a campaign. It has to be said for those of us that kind of remember that. Their polling since has gone up by about 3 times, so to somewhere, depending on one poll had them at 22%, so pretty much 3 times what they got at the general election. Others, it's slightly down on that, maybe high teens.
Mm.
Now you sort of try and extrapolate from that, as I was talking about earlier, how you then model the sort of seat distribution. It looks like they may get somewhere between 15 and 20 seats in the
It's quite a
Holyrood
lot.
chamber. Yeah, and there is, depending on how things change between now and May next year, they may even be the second biggest. They may even be the second biggest party.
Mhm.
Now, of course, that will change the political culture in Scotland.
Yep.
It will certainly change how Parliament operates
Yeah.
and works. They will have representation on committees. They will have all the other sort of trappings, so to speak, of what goes with,
First
sort of
Minister's question
significant,
and things like that.
there's
Yeah.
that kind of stuff that goes with having a significant presence
Mm.
in the Parliament. And, um, it's unclear, at least at the moment, who a lot of those individuals will be.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we're not really particularly talking about at the moment is a number of MSPs that are standing down next year
Yep.
and quite how experienced a lot of them are.
Yeah.
We're losing 2 ex-First Ministers, we're losing the current Deputy First Minister, a lot of current and previous cabinet ministers as well, party leaders from opposition as well. And so there is actually just, I mean, party politics aside, the Parliament is going to look different, not just because there's going to be this, it looks like there's going to be this relatively significant group of Reform UK members, but just because it's going to be really quite inexperienced, I think, and the whole feel of it is going to be quite different.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of them stepping down that have been in the Scottish Parliament since it was reconvened.
Yeah,
I
well,
suppose. I mean, John Swinney is the exception to that. He's going to stick around, I think.
Yeah, Jackie Bailey and people like
Yeah.
there are one or two, but that you're right. There'll be hardly any left. Now, there's an argument that's quite a good thing. The place needs freshening up a bit, perhaps.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in my world, but people that kind of comment on Parliament, how the committee system works, how passing legislation works, would argue that things need a bit of geeing up, things need a bit of freshening.
Yeah.
A lot of people would argue that what we're about to witness, or what we might be about to witness, is not particularly the type of freshening that we need, but nonetheless, there is likely to be a really different feel, both politically and in terms of just the membership of the Parliament and the levels of experience and expertise that are there. So it's really going to feel quite different, I think, on a number of fronts in the future.
Yeah, I think it will. So one of the big ongoing stories from polls, I think, this year as well, is when it comes to polling in Scotland, there's this sort of decoupling of support for independents and the SNP, which we've seen over time. What's your assessment of that? And is it something that you think will continue, or will it potentially go back the other way and they'll bring us together? What's your kind of...
Well, so I guess the first thing says is a bit of a polling nerd or whatever, and someone who's been around for quite a while now. It's probably one of the most interesting things.
It really is. It's fascinating.
It is absolutely fascinating, not least because I spent, I don't know, 10 years trawling around not trolling,
No.
media studios, doing podcasts like this, and just talking about how the support for independence, the support for the SNP were pretty much the same group of people.
Yeah.
They went in lockstep. One went up, the other went up.
Yeah.
One went down, the other went down. So, and it was kind of not dull, but it was you know relatively kind of uninteresting, I
Mm.
suppose, on one level. And now over a period of time, the last couple of years, you're right, we have seen this decoupling. So support for independence is actually still sort of pretty healthy on average, but about half. And
Yeah.
the very latest poll had 49% support for independence. That is not at all out of kilter. There are other polls recently that have it just over 50%. So on average, it's at around 50%. But as we were talking about earlier, support for the SNP has gone down to
Mm.
35%.
Yeah,
So it's
quite a
going
big
to
gap.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at polling from around sort of even up to sort of 2021, 2022, about 90%, and in some polls more, of people that voted for the SNP, sorry, who supported independence, would vote for the SNP as well.
Mm.
That figure now is about two-thirds. So about two-thirds of independent supporters will vote for the SNP. So, the question is, well, where have the other third gone?
Yeah, I was
Now,
gonna ask
some
the
of them have
same.
gone to the Greens
Yeah.
in more numbers than before. Some have gone to Labour. Um, a few have actually gone to Reform as well.
That's fascinating, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, and
You
there's
think, why has that happened?
yeah, and yeah. But there is, of course, there's an independent streak. There's a
Yeah,
kind of we want to be,
there is a
we
streak
don't
of
want
kind
to
of
be in unions. We want,
yeah.
so there is that as well. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize that because
No.
it's relatively small in number, but it does exist.
Mm.
But more likely they've gone to Labour and to the Greens. And of course, this happened during a period where support for the SNP declined significantly after Nicola Sturgeon resigned and during Humza Yousaf's tenure in Butte
Mm.
House. And a lot of that hasn't gone back.
Mm.
Hasn't gone back to the SNP. And strategically, one of the really big things that the SNP is kind of um, grappling with, I guess, at the moment as the election sort of draws into view, is, well, what can they do um, to bring those people back? Because many of them did support the SNP quite fervently
Yeah.
up until a couple of years ago, drifted off. Will the party get any of them back or many of them back um, before May next year? Which is why the party sort of grapples with the kind of the independence issue, and quite how when we saw it was fairly front and center earlier this week with
Yes.
the First Minister's stuff on energy. But
Mm.
there is a sort of a tension within the party about, well, how to, the extent to which independence should be kind of front and center of the campaign, which may bring some of those lost voters back. But on the other hand, there is also evidence to suggest that, support for another referendum is not, certainly in the short term, is not particularly high. When
Mm.
people like me measure, what are the big concerns of the electorate, independence does not rank particularly highly.
No.
So that kind of mitigates against, making it too much of a front and center issue. There are kind of pros and cons to that strategy, which of course the party is acutely aware of.
Yeah.
And there's not an easy solution to kind of keeping your base really motivated and thinking, that it could happen in the next kind of period,
Yeah.
while, risking alienating others who, support the SNP, but take a sort of different approach to independence.
Yeah, it's they're in a really tricky spot, I think, and it's interesting what you say about how some voters have gone to the Greens, some to Reform, because that suggests that some are maybe frustrated with the fact that the SNP have gone more, centralize themselves a bit, and they've gone a bit less radical than they
Mhm.
were, so they're maybe moving to parties that seem a bit more radical in whatever
Sure,
direction that they want.
sure.
But also, if John Swinney starts thinking, "Oh, I've got to be a bit more radical," then there's the risk that he goes down where the party were going down before, and that people didn't think they were being sensible enough.
Yeah,
So it's that tricky
and you
spot, isn't it?
also, if you're in the SNP, you don't want to give a gift to your opponents, right?
Hmm.
So if you're if you're a Tory, if you're Russell Finley or, someone senior in the Tory party, you really want the SNP to be talking about independence because it gives you the leverage to get back
Yeah.
in. Part of the Tory success in the 2010s,
Mm.
Scotland, 2016, and so on, was because they positioned themselves as
No to
the
independence. Yeah.
defenders of the union, the
Mm.
absolute defenders of the union. the strongest defenders, the absolute, there's no kind of middle ground on this, and they reaped some political reward, an electoral reward for doing that. So it's definitely not an easy strategy to agree on, but it is endlessly kind of fascinating what's happening, and I agree with you that that's kind of in sort of in polling terms, that's one of the most interesting things that's happened.
Yeah, I think one area where the SNP do look like they might struggle in the Scottish elections is the Highlands, where the Lib Dems are increasingly confident that they can get something back there. How do you see that panning out?
Yeah, I think so. If you talk to the Lib Dems, they are, and some of the polling will sort of bear this out, that they are very confident, or varying degrees of confidence,
Yeah.
fairly to very confident, very confident. The last time I spoke to the Lib Dem leader, that they would do well. I think that those areas are really key for them. Not least the current but standing down Deputy First Minister's seat. I think they've got their eye on that seat,
Yeah.
but others up there. There are, in fact, we had we just published a big survey of rural Scotland, which kind of highlights some of the real difficulties and hardships that are being faced by a lot of people in rural communities.
Yeah.
And a lot of very deep dissatisfaction with things like local public transport or rural public transport, access to rural health facilities, and so on. So for opposition parties, and particularly the Lib Dems, given their tradition in some of these areas, there is, I would say, quite a lot to go on
Yeah.
and sort of tap into as far as those issues are concerned.
That makes sense.
Hence hence I think the confidence of people like the Lib Dem leader Alex Cole-Hamilton and others, that they will do well, and that is supported at least to some extent by some of the polling that we're seeing.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see how the Lib Dems do in May, because I think they often are slightly the forgotten party, aren't they, a little bit in the Scottish Parliament particularly.
They are, and of course the other thing is that we may well get a parliament that's much more fragmented than it is now.
Yeah.
It does look at the moment like the SNP will win, but what if, say, the SNP get sort of 50 seats, so quite a long way short of an overall majority, then they might be looking for more sort of formal electoral arrangements
Yeah.
with other parties, a bit like we saw with the Greens in the current parliament. God, it feels like ages ago.
I know, yeah.
That's say the last parliament.
Yeah,
It's actually this one.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of commentary around about the Lib Dems maybe
Yeah.
being a player in such, or a kingmaker, as the awful phrase goes.
Yes.
In terms of those negotiations that kind of may or may not be necessary, depending on what the electorate throws up in May. So yeah, I think you're right. I think the Lib Dem vote is one to keep a very close eye on.
Yeah. So we've talked about Labour reform, the SNP, a bit about the Lib Dems there. So I think the final topic I'd like to discuss is the Greens, because they have been in England and Wales, they've been enjoying an incredible couple of months under Zach Polanski since he was elected, riding a real high. But I guess we're wondering up here whether that bounce is going to pass to the Scottish Greens. We've seen their membership rising gradually a little bit. We've done a few news stories on it, and it's now at a record level for the Scottish Greens. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something that is likely to pass on up here, or not? I'm guessing from your face you're thinking maybe
no, sorry, it's just no question. I think it's possible. So there's there's sort of several things I think to kind of unpick here.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So what's the Green vote looking like? The Greens have a sort of relatively small 10% vote share, give or take, on the regional list vote.
Yeah.
But which really, if you take a step back, has hardly changed over the course. I mean, it's gone up in some polls, slightly under 10% in others, but it's remained remarkably stable. So it has a relatively small but very kind of loyal following, right? Which current polling would suggest the Greens will do at least equally as well as they did in 2021, and perhaps with a chance of having one or two extra MSPs. Now, the reason that's kind of worth noting is that traditionally, whether it's at a kind of UK level and certainly in European politics, where kind of coalitions are much more normal,
Mm.
the small party that goes into a coalition usually gets an absolute doing, right? Gets an
Yeah.
absolute drubbing. Well, you look at the Lib Dems
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, yeah.
after their experience of going into a coalition with the big bad Tories. I mean, they actually just
Yeah.
sort of ate them up and spat them out
Yeah.
electorally, and you see it kind of all over Europe as well. So I know it wasn't a kind of formal coalition in the Butte House Agreement, but they were in government. They
Yeah,
shared,
they were.
they shared responsibility. They had power. But it doesn't seem to have really touched aside as far as
Mm.
the electorate are concerned. They don't seem to have kind of suffered electorally as a result of that. So that's kind of quite interesting just by itself. So it looks like they'll do at least equally as well as they did in 2021. So then to your question, I suppose, around what's happening. So UK polling would suggest now that the Greens are up to, depending on what poll you look at, 15, 16,
Yeah.
17% of the vote, which is pretty extraordinary,
Yeah.
right? And he is Polanski. He is sort of relatively popular, particularly with his base and with the
Yes.
wider kind of left, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, and just as a bit of a sidebar, if you look at the overall electorate, he is still more unpopular than popular. But that's
Right.
about the times that we live in.
Yeah, of course. Everybody's unpopular.
Yeah, everyone's
Yeah.
unpopular. It's just degrees of unpopularity.
Yeah.
But putting that to one side, so I think for the Scottish Greens, there's a really interesting sort of strategic decision to be made, which is, well, to what extent do you try and tap in to that in this campaign? Um, Both in terms of kind of how you do you use him? Do you get him up?
Yeah.
I mean, not fronting the campaign. They've got two new, young, energetic leaders who are, I'm sure, more than capable of running their own campaign. But to what extent do you tap into him and bring him up here and kind of use him to that extent during? So that's kind of one interesting
Yeah.
thing, as
Absolutely.
well as some of the kind of the policy choices that he's making and communicating in the way that he communicates. It strikes me that whether you like what he's saying or not like what he's saying, his communication style, his directness, his sort of social media friendliness, and all the rest of it
Mm.
is quite striking.
Yeah, it is.
And so, can you use some of those techniques as well
Mm.
to be getting your messages across? So, I would say there's sort of potentially is quite exciting for the Greens to the extent to which they might kind of tap in and try and ride that wave of what's going on in the wider sort of Green movement at a UK level. I mean, you don't want the kind of downside, I suppose, is that you don't want him sort of dominating the campaign. There are two new leaders who
Yeah.
sort of need their own space, and uh, and I don't know, how well does he know Scotland? How sort of imbued is he in our sort of politics and so on?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Does that matter? Not sure either. But there are kind of risks attached, I guess, to this, as well as being sort of potential benefits in terms of what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you say about them start having a good starting point. The fact that they've been in government and they've not fallen backwards in any way. So I suppose it is an exciting time because they may feel that the only way is up for the Greens, I think, at
Yeah,
the moment.
sure.
But it's how they make the most of, if they can, this huge bounce that's happening with Zach Polanski. I guess the conundrum there is that the English and Welsh Green Party isn't actually linked in any way
Sure,
to
there
the
is.
Scottish
Yeah,
Greens.
yeah,
They are
quite right.
separate parties, unlike UK Labour and Scottish Labour, who are I would say, intrinsically linked. It depend. You might. I suppose people's views on that might vary how much they're linked, but they are certainly more linked than these two parties. And in the not so distant past, the Scottish Greens and the English Greens actually kind of fell out.
Yes,
At
of course.
points.
Yeah.
The Scottish Green members voted to cut ties
Yep.
with the English Greens. So I guess there's that complication as well. Do they bring him back? How much do they bring back that relationship? How much do they bring that back, the relationship? And I think it's really interesting what you say about how much does Zach Polanski know about Scotland? Are they gonna, if they involve him too much, is there gonna be complaints about an English
No,
politician
quite.
coming up here?
Yeah. No, particularly in the context of them having, a very fresh leadership
Yes.
team. You
Yep.
know, so there are risks in it, and of course you're right. Historically, you know, it hasn't always been as cordial uh, as it could be.
Mm.
I mean, my understanding, when you talk to people inside the Greens, that appears to be not so much of an issue
Yeah, I
now
think
as it
it's
was then.
petered out. Yeah.
I think things are probably much more friendly than they were there. Which is, of course, not to say that there's an automatic assumption
Mm.
that he will feature kind of heavily in the campaign, and maybe it's more about taking the lessons from, as I said earlier, the kind of communication styles and the ways of kind of presenting, as it is actually using him
Yeah.
personally to help them. We'll see, but I think there is, from what I can gather, I think there is, you know, uh, at least an appeal from within the Scottish Greens, the Scottish Greens to look at this stuff and to try and see what lessons they can learn from what's going on elsewhere,
Yeah.
which seems reasonable.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for
You're
being with
welcome.
us and chatting with us. I think we've covered a lot of ground
We have,
there,
yep.
and got had a chat about all the different parties and what's going on in the polls. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and join us next time.